Sarah Mitchell was 34 years old when her life fell apart in a single afternoon. She was sitting in a lawyer's office on the 42nd floor of a glass building in downtown Chicago. The chairs were leather. The carpet was thick. Everything in that room cost more money than most people made in a month. But Sarah did not feel rich. She felt small. She felt like a woman who had made a very big mistake and was only now beginning to understand how deep that mistake had gone. Across the table sat Daniel Harrington, her husband, or her soon-to-be ex-husband. He was wearing a navy suit that was pressed so perfectly it looked like it had never been touched by human hands. His silver cufflinks caught the light every time he moved. He did not look at Sarah. He looked at the papers in front of him, and he spoke to his lawyer in a low, calm voice, like a man discussing a business deal, which, Sarah was beginning to understand, was exactly what this was to him. Daniel Harrington was the CEO of Harrington Tech Solutions, a company he had built over 15 years into something worth over $400 million. He had been on the cover of 2 business magazines. He gave speeches at conferences. He was the kind of man people called a visionary. He was also the kind of man who could sit across from the woman he had spent 11 years with and feel absolutely nothing. Sarah had met Daniel when she was 23 years old. She had been working as a junior marketing assistant at a small firm in the city. He had walked into a meeting she was running and had looked at her like she was the most interesting thing in the room. He was 10 years older than her. He was confident and smart, and he had a way of making Sarah feel like she was the only person who mattered. She had fallen in love with him quickly and completely, the way young people sometimes do before they understand that love is not always the same thing as safety. They had married 2 years after meeting. They did not sign a prenuptial agreement. Daniel had been the one to say it was unnecessary. He had told her that prenups were for people who expected things to go wrong, and he did not expect things to go wrong. Sarah had believed him. She had been the kind of woman who believed the people she loved. For the first few years, the marriage had been good. They lived in a beautiful home in Lincoln Park. They took vacations to places Sarah had only seen in magazines before. Daniel worked long hours, but he came home, and when he came home, he was present. He was funny. He was kind. He remembered small things she said and brought them up weeks later. Sarah had thought she was lucky. Then his company began to grow faster than either of them had expected. The money came in quickly. The travel increased. The long hours became longer. Daniel started spending more time with investors and board members and people Sarah did not know. He started coming home tired in a way that made him seem far away even when he was standing right next to her. Sarah told herself this was normal. She told herself every successful marriage went through difficult seasons. She had given up her own career to support his. That had been a quiet decision that happened slowly rather than all at once. First, she had cut back her hours to manage their household better. Then she had stopped working entirely when Daniel mentioned that it would be easier if she could travel with him more. She had spent years organizing his schedule, entertaining his clients, supporting his vision. She had poured herself into a life that was entirely built around another person. And then one morning, Daniel had sat down across from her at their kitchen table and told her he wanted a divorce. He had been very calm about it. He had not cried. He had explained it the way he explained things at work, clearly, with a plan already in place. He told her he had been unhappy for some time. He told her he had consulted a lawyer. He told her the house was technically in his name because of how they had structured their finances years earlier. He told her that while he intended to be fair, he also intended to protect what he had built. What followed in that lawyer's office on the 42nd floor was the kind of moment that strips everything away. Daniel's legal team had prepared documents that were detailed and complicated and designed, Sarah slowly realized, to give her as little as possible. Because they had never signed a prenuptial agreement, she had certain rights. But Daniel had spent years carefully structuring his assets in ways that made them difficult to reach. His company shares were held through a series of corporate entities. The house, the accounts, the investments, all of it had been arranged in a way that left Sarah standing in a field with nothing growing in it. She had a small personal savings account. She had a car. She had the clothes in her wardrobe and 11 years of a life that no longer belonged to her. Her own lawyer, a tired man named Gerald who charged less than Daniel's team because that was what Sarah could now afford, leaned over and told her quietly that fighting this in court would be expensive, uncertain, and could take years. He told her that Daniel's team was very good and that they had structured things deliberately. He told her she needed to be realistic. Sarah looked across the table at Daniel. He was still not looking at her. She did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She did not beg or plead or throw the leather-bound documents across the expensive carpet. Something had shifted inside her in those weeks between when Daniel told her he wanted a divorce and this moment in the lawyer's office. She had done her grieving privately, in the small apartment she had rented with the money from her savings account. She had cried in the shower and in the car and at 3 in the morning when the world was quiet. She had allowed herself to feel the full weight of what was happening. But she had also begun to think. Sarah Mitchell had spent 11 years making herself invisible for someone else's success. She had organized, supported, sacrificed, and stepped aside. She had believed that was what love required. But sitting in that lawyer's office, watching Daniel look at papers instead of at her, she understood something clearly for the first time. She had made herself small to make someone else feel large. And now that she was no longer useful to that purpose, she had been set aside. She signed what she had to sign. She stood up. She put on her coat. She picked up her bag. Daniel finally looked at her then. Perhaps he had expected tears. Perhaps he had expected her to say something. To make this harder, to make it feel like something. Instead, Sarah looked at him with an expression he could not read, and she said 2 words. "Thank you." Then she walked out. Her heels were quiet on the thick carpet. The elevator took her down 42 floors to the street. Outside, Chicago was cold and gray and full of people moving in every direction. Sarah stood on the sidewalk for a moment and breathed in the cold air. She had $4,300 in her bank account. She had a car. She had a small apartment she had rented month to month. She also had something that nobody could put into a corporate entity or hide behind a lawyer's filing. She had spent 11 years watching one of the most successful business minds in the city operate from the inside. She had sat in on meetings. She had listened to strategies. She had learned, without being given credit for learning, how the world of business worked at a level most people never get to see. She had skills she had never used and knowledge she had never claimed. Sarah Mitchell walked to her car. She put her key in the ignition. She did not look back at the building. She was going to begin. Sarah did not tell many people what had happened right away. She told her sister, Maya, who lived in Milwaukee and who had never trusted Daniel from the beginning. Maya had driven down the weekend after the divorce was finalized and had sat with Sarah in her small apartment eating takeout pasta and saying very little, which was exactly what Sarah needed. Maya was the kind of person who understood that sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is simply show up and not try to fix anything. Sarah also told her friend Priya, who had known her since college and who worked as a financial analyst in the city. Priya had listened carefully and then had said something that stayed with Sarah for a long time. She said, "You know more than you think you do. The question is whether you're going to start acting like it." Sarah thought about that a lot in those early weeks. Her apartment was a 1-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a building in Wicker Park. It was modest in the way that felt sharp after 11 years of a different kind of life. The kitchen was small. The walls were thin enough that she could hear her neighbor's television at night. But it was hers in a way the Lincoln Park house had never fully been. She paid the rent herself. She chose what went in the refrigerator. She went to sleep and woke up on her own schedule. And while that was lonely at first, it was also, slowly, something else. It was quiet in a way that allowed her to hear herself think. She started writing things down. This was something she had always done in her earlier life, before Daniel, when she was working in marketing and building something of her own. She had always kept notes, ideas, observations, patterns she noticed. During the marriage she had stopped, not because anyone told her to, but because there had never seemed to be space for it. Now she filled a plain notebook with everything she had learned over 11 years of watching Daniel's company grow. She wrote down how he had structured his early pitch meetings. She wrote down the language he used when he was trying to get investors excited. She wrote down what she had noticed about the companies that approached him for partnerships, what they had in common, what they were looking for, why some deals came together and others fell apart. She wrote down conversations she had listened to at dinners where the men at the table had not paid much attention to the quiet woman beside Daniel Harrington, because she was just his wife and wives were furniture at those dinners. That had been a mistake on their part. Sarah had paid attention. She had always paid attention. She had simply never had a reason to do anything with what she noticed. Now she did. She found a job within 3 weeks of the divorce being finalized. It was not a grand job. It was a marketing coordinator position at a mid-sized firm called Caldwell and Park that handled branding and communications for small to mid-sized businesses. The salary was modest. The office was ordinary. Her colleagues were mostly younger than her and had no idea who her ex-husband was, which she was grateful for. She did not mention Daniel. She did not talk about where she had come from. She showed up on time. She worked carefully, and she listened. She was very good at listening. Within 2 months, her manager had noticed that Sarah had an unusual instinct for understanding what clients actually needed, as opposed to what they asked for on the surface. She had a way of reading between the lines of a brief and identifying the real problem underneath. This was not something she had been taught in a classroom. It was something she had developed over years of navigating Daniel's world, where people rarely said exactly what they meant and where you had to understand the space between words. Her manager's name was Elaine Cho. Elaine was direct and efficient and did not waste time, which Sarah respected. One afternoon, Elaine called Sarah into her office and asked her to lead a client presentation that had originally been assigned to a more senior team member who had fallen ill. The client was a small logistics company trying to rebrand after a difficult year. It was not a glamorous account, but it was a chance. Sarah prepared for that presentation the way she had once prepared for dinners where Daniel was trying to close a deal. She researched the client's history. She studied their competition. She thought about what story they needed to tell and how that story could be made true rather than just attractive. She put together materials that were clear and honest and built around what she had found rather than what she thought they wanted to hear. The presentation went well. Better than well. The client signed an extended contract and specifically requested that Sarah remain involved in their account. Elaine had looked at her afterward with something new in her expression. Not surprise exactly, but recalibration. After that, things moved faster. Sarah was given more responsibility. She was moved into a senior coordinator role and then, 8 months after joining the company, into an account manager position. She was earning more. She was saving carefully. She was also spending her evenings doing something else entirely. She had started building a small consulting side project. It had no name yet and no formal structure. It was simply Sarah, her laptop, and a handful of small business owners she had connected with through a local entrepreneurship group she had joined mostly because Priya had told her she should get out of the apartment more. She had gone expecting to feel out of place and had instead found herself in conversation after conversation where she had something useful to say. Small business owners had specific problems. They had good products and poor messaging. They had clear vision and no strategy for communicating that vision to the people who needed to hear it. They had limited budgets and were often being given advice designed for companies 10 times their size. Sarah understood these problems not from a textbook, but from having watched, at close range, how a company grew from nothing into something significant. She knew what the early stages looked like. She knew what mistakes were expensive and which ones were recoverable. She started offering short consulting sessions. She charged modestly at first, $200 for a 2-hour session. She was fully booked within 6 weeks, mostly through word of mouth, because the people she worked with told other people, and those other people called her. She raised her rate. She was still fully booked. She began to understand something that she had not allowed herself to understand before. She had spent 11 years believing that the value in her marriage had been Daniel's, his vision, his drive, his intelligence. She had told herself she was the support structure, the background, the person who made space for someone else's greatness. But the truth was different and more complicated than that. She had contributed to his success in ways that had never been named or recognized. She had skills that were real and developed in hers. Daniel had not left her with nothing. He had left her with everything she had quietly built inside herself while she was busy building his life. She was not angry about this anymore, not in the raw, burning way she had been in those first weeks. What she felt now was something cooler and more focused. She was not interested in revenge. She was interested in building. 14 months after walking out of that lawyer's office, Sarah had saved enough money to take a calculated risk. She had been thinking about it carefully for several months, running numbers with Priya, researching the market, building a client list. Elaine at Caldwell and Park had offered her a promotion that would have been difficult to turn down a year earlier. Sarah turned it down. She handed in her notice on a Tuesday morning. Elaine had looked at her for a long moment and then nodded, like someone watching a thing happen that they had suspected was coming. "You were too good for this place anyway," Elaine said. It was the kind of compliment that felt true rather than polite. Sarah walked out of the Caldwell and Park office for the last time on a Thursday evening. She took the train home. She sat at her small kitchen table and opened her laptop and looked at the homepage she had been quietly building for the last 3 months. Mitchell Strategy Group. Brand and business consulting for growing companies. She had a logo. She had a website. She had 11 clients already waiting. She pressed publish. The first year of running Mitchell Strategy Group was not easy. Sarah had expected difficulty. She had prepared for it practically. She had savings to cover 6 months of basic expenses, a clear client base to begin with, and a service that she knew from experience people needed. But knowing difficulty is coming and living inside it are two different things, and there were weeks in that first year when she sat at her kitchen table at midnight wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. The hardest part was not the work. The work she loved. It was everything around the work, the invoicing that clients delayed, the contracts that needed to be clear enough to protect her, the constant task of finding new business while also delivering excellent results for existing clients. She was doing everything herself. She was the strategist, the accountant, the administrator, and the salesperson. She worked long hours, and she was tired in a way that was different from exhaustion. It was the tiredness of someone building something, which has a kind of purpose inside it that ordinary tiredness does not. She made mistakes. She underpriced a major project and delivered 3 months of work for fees that did not reflect the value she had created. She took on a client who was disorganized in ways that cost her more time than the contract was worth. She spent 2 weeks on a proposal for a company that ultimately chose a larger firm, which was a loss she had not fully prepared herself for emotionally, even though she knew rationally that this was simply part of the business. But she also got things right. She had a gift for finding the essential truth inside a client's business and helping them see it clearly. Many of the small and mid-sized companies she worked with had been built by people who were experts in their industry, but who had never been taught how to explain what they did in a way that connected with the people they were trying to reach. Sarah could sit with a founder for an hour, ask the right questions, and come back 2 weeks later with a strategy that felt so obvious the founders sometimes asked why they hadn't seen it themselves. That was not a small thing. That was the kind of work that got talked about. By the end of her first full year in business, Mitchell Strategy Group had 23 clients. Her revenue was just over $280,000. After expenses, she was clearing more than she had made in any job she had held before her marriage, and she was working for herself, on her terms, doing work she had chosen. She moved apartments. The new place was bigger, still in Wicker Park, which she had come to love for its noise and its coffee shops and its feeling of being a neighborhood where people were in the middle of things rather than finished with them. She had a proper home office now. She had a good chair and a wide desk and plants on the windowsill that she remembered to water, which felt like evidence of a certain kind of stability. She hired her first employee in the spring of her second year. Her name was Kezia, 26 years old, sharp, with a background in digital marketing and an instinct for the kind of data that told useful stories. Sarah had interviewed 8 people and chosen Kezia because of the way she asked questions. Good questions, Sarah had learned, were the most important skill. The business grew. By her 3rd year, Mitchell Strategy Group had a small team of 4 people and a client roster that included several companies with revenues in the tens of millions. She had developed a particular specialty in helping companies that were at an inflection point, businesses that had grown past their original model and needed a clear strategy for what came next. This was, she sometimes thought with a private smile, something she knew something about personally. She had been featured in a business journal that focused on women entrepreneurs. The article was short and placed on an inside page, but it was accurate, and she was proud of it. Her sister Maya had framed a copy and sent it to her, which made Sarah laugh and then feel something warm and solid in her chest. She had built a life that was entirely hers. It was in the middle of her 3rd year that she heard about Daniel again for the first time in a significant way. She had not been following him. She had made a deliberate decision not to keep track of his life or his company or what he was doing. It had not always been easy in the beginning, when the impulse to look had been strong and the hurt had still been close to the surface. But she had held to it, and eventually it had become genuine indifference rather than practiced restraint. It was Priya who mentioned it, carefully, over dinner on a Friday evening. Harrington Tech Solutions was in trouble. There had been a series of decisions, investments in ventures that had not paid off, a significant contract that had fallen apart publicly, some questions from the financial press about how the company was being managed. Daniel's name was in the papers, but not in the way it used to be. Sarah listened. She felt very little. There was no satisfaction in it. Or perhaps there was a small, quiet satisfaction, the kind you feel when you understand that the universe is not entirely without logic. But it was not the feeling she might have expected. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel vindication. She felt mostly interested in her pasta and in the conversation she and Priya were having about Priya's upcoming vacation. Daniel's difficulties were Daniel's difficulties. They had nothing to do with her anymore. What it had to do with her was the call she received the following Monday morning from a number she did not recognize, which turned out to be a representative from a private investment group that had been watching her work. They had seen the Business Journal article. They had spoken to 3 of her current clients, who had said things that had apparently been persuasive. They were interested in exploring whether Sarah would be open to a partnership, capital investment in exchange for equity, with the goal of scaling Mitchell Strategy Group into a national firm. She took the meeting. She went in prepared the way she always went into things now, with clear numbers, clear terms, and a clear understanding of what she was and was not willing to give away. She was not the woman who had sat across from Daniel in a lawyer's office without knowing what was in the documents she was being asked to sign. She had spent 3 years learning what she did not know and making sure she knew it. She had lawyers she trusted and an accountant who was honest and a support network of people, Priya, Maya, Elaine, Kezia, and others, who could help her see her own blind spots. The investment discussions took 4 months. There were moments of frustration and moments of doubt, and one particularly difficult week when the deal seemed like it might fall apart over a clause in the equity structure that Sarah was not willing to compromise on. Her lawyer told her she was being firm. She told her lawyer she was being clear about what she had built and what it was worth. The deal closed on a Thursday morning. Mitchell Strategy Group received a capital investment that allowed Sarah to hire 6 new people, open a second office in the city, and begin serving clients in 3 new markets. The firm did not belong entirely to Sarah anymore. It never entirely would again, but she retained the majority of it, and more importantly, she retained what it was. Its values, its approach, its particular way of seeing a problem and working toward a solution. She stood in the new office space on the afternoon of the signing, before the furniture had arrived, before any of it looked like anything. The room was empty, and the light came in through large windows, and Chicago was bright and cold outside. Kezia was there, and 2 of the new people, and they ordered food and sat on the floor and talked about what they were building. Sarah thought, briefly, about that afternoon in the lawyer's office. The leather chairs, the thick carpet, Daniel looking at his documents, the feeling of having nothing. She thought about walking out, the cold air on her face, the $4,300. She thought about all the things she had known without knowing she knew them, waiting inside her for a reason to come forward. She did not say any of this out loud. There was no need to. The office around her was evidence enough. The people sitting on the floor eating takeout and talking about the future were evidence enough. She had not pleaded. She had not fought for scraps. She had not spent her energy trying to take back what someone else had moved out of reach. She had simply turned around and built something better. And the thing about building something yourself, from nothing, on your own terms, the thing Sarah Mitchell understood now in a way she could not have understood it before, is that nobody can take it from you the same way. It is yours in the deepest sense. Not because of a contract or a document or a name on a building. Because you made it, and the making is inside you, and that goes wherever you go. She had started with $4,300 and the knowledge a man had given her no credit for. She had built something worth a great deal more than that. And she was only just beginning.